When it comes to Japanese battleships, the Fuso-class are often overlooked. At least overlooked by serious overviews. They're certainly the subject of many a meme and joke about their pagodas. I get a laugh out of those too, so I won't be a hypocrite and say they aren't funny. Even so, these ships are an interesting case study. What were fairly powerful ships when launched quickly became obsolescent. By the time they were actually called upon to serve in the 1940s, they were obsolete. No amount of refits or additions to their bridge was going to change that. As a result, even as the IJN bled itself white, the Fusos were held back. Until the absolute last moment. For this video, we'll be looking at the second of the two, Yamashiro. I will return to Fuso herself at a later date. Let's begin with the usual brief look at the technical specifications. As initially designed, Yamashiro displaced just under 30,000 tons at her normal loading. This rose to 36,500 tons at her full load. Quite large, actually, for 1915. That displacement largely came from the inefficient, if striking to look at, turret farm layout of her main battery. Yamashiro, along with her sister, carried 12 356mm 14-inch guns. A respectable main battery, certainly, but carried in a distinctive manner. No fewer than 6 twin turrets. 2 superfiring turrets on the bow, followed by 2 amidships turrets. One directly behind the forward funnel, and the other directly behind the second funnel, followed in turn by a second superfiring pair on the stern. 12 14-inch guns, but spread over the entire length of the ship. To support the big guns, Yamashiro carried 16 152mm 6-inch secondary guns. These were carried in single casement mountings, 8 to a side. Rounding her weaponry off, as is basically Japanese tradition, was a heavy torpedo battery. 6 submerged torpedo tubes. That rounds off the weaponry, so what about her armor? Well, Yamashiro was decently armored for her day. The battleship had a main belt of 305mm, 12 inches in thickness. Deck armor was thinner, although not terrible for 1915, at a maximum thickness of 51mm, or 2 inches. All of this weaponry and armor was pushed through the water at around 22.5 knots by 40,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. Actual service speed varied from 22 to 23 knots, depending on loading and how hard the power plant was pushed. With her initial technical details done, I'll move on to service history. The ship that became Yamashiro was laid down on November 20th, 1913. Her launch followed on November 3rd, 1915, which is a fairly average construction time. Considering that Japan was still new to building ships this size, it's actually a bit impressive. In any event, Yamashiro was launched by the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, and her fitting out process began. The ship would, eventually, commission into the Imperial Japanese Navy on March 31st, 1917. Not that she would get up to much in her service career. By 1917, the Great War at Sea was basically over. Even in Europe, the great battles had come and gone. In Asia, the Central Powers were basically gone by 1915. By 1917, the German and Austrian colonies were long since under occupation. As a result, Yamashiro's initial service consisted almost entirely of training and patrol duty. She would sail in Japanese waters, or off of China, but it amounted to little of real note. The ending of the war in 1918 did little to change that. The end of the 1910s and into the early 1920s was just more of the same, training and patrols. In fact, by 1921, Yamashiro was a training ship. The Japanese had wanted to replace the Fusos, with new construction by that point. The Washington Naval Treaty, however, put an end to that. Instead, these ships continued to soldier on. For Yamashiro's part, that was a simple continuation of what she had been doing. She remained on the same quiet duties, with the odd refit here and there, for the rest of the 1920s. These, among other things, began the buildup of her infamous pagoda. Not all the changes were so permanent, however. In 1922, she temporarily carried a flying-off platform on her number 2 turret. This was used to test launching fighter aircraft, specifically Gloucester Sparrowhawks and Sopwith Camels. It worked well enough, but it was soon taken off the ship. After this, nothing major happened until 1930. In December of that year, Yamashiro went in for her major overhaul and modernization. This rebuild lasted from 1930 until 1935 and was as comprehensive as the Japanese could afford. While Yamashiro had already begun to pick up the pagoda mast, it was during this refit that the mast really took shape. It became a towering 40-meter, 130-foot tall monstrosity. Admittedly, I think it has its own weird charm, but the thing was strange looking. This was done to fit fire control platforms, compass platforms, and general control areas. It was a creative solution, but one that likely made the ship rather top-heavy. At the same time, her aft mast was rebuilt and expanded. Not to the same extent, but still enough to fit 127mm 5-inch anti-aircraft guns to it. Other changes during this refit included torpedo bulges and improved armor protection. Her main belt remained the same, but her deck armor was substantially increased to 4.5 inches. To further improve survivability, the submerged torpedo tubes were also removed at this time. Yamashiro also gained a catapult and a crane on the stern to support float planes. Probably the biggest change outside the pagoda was to her stern. This was, in a similar manner as on the Congo-class, lengthened. In the case of Yamashiro, by 25 feet. This was matched by her entire power plant being torn out and replaced with more modern equipment. This was partially to counteract the increased displacement and the torpedo bulges, but it actually increased her speed to around 24.5 knots, thanks to 75,000 shaft horsepower. Finally, the main battery was marginally improved. Elevation increased to 43 degrees, and the turret rangefinders were modernized. As said, this refit lasted from 1930 through to 1935. As a result, Yamashiro missed half of the 1930s right out of the gate. She wouldn't see much service for the second half either. Upon completion of this refit, Yamashiro saw out the 1930s with more secondary roles and minor refits. This continued into the 1940s, as it had done for the rest of her career. Now, in fairness, Yamashiro was outdated by 1940. Her major modernization, for all the time and expense, had only kept her marginally up to date. She was slow, largely outdated, and by no means a frontline warship by this point. This is reflected in her returning to training ship duty in 1941. Even when the Pacific War began, late in 1941, Yamashiro remained on secondary roles for much of the war. When Japan set out to attack Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Yamashiro was held back. She sailed with her sister as distant support. This saw no action, and Yamashiro returned to Japan, where she remained for much of the war. Her next moment of excitement wouldn't come until April 18, 1942. That being the Doolittle Raid. After American medium bombers hit the home islands, Yamashiro was one of the ships sent out to chase the aircraft carriers. This was, unsurprisingly, a failure. Halsey had left soon after launching the strike, and Yamashiro was never going to catch up to fast aircraft carriers. Following the failure to catch Enterprise and Hornet, Yamashiro was back in Japan. She wouldn't leave again until May 29, 1942, when the Battle of Midway rolled around. Even this was on secondary duty, however. The Fuso-class was sent north to provide reserve support for the Aleutians operation. While the Kido Butai was mauled off Midway on June 4th, these old battleships saw no action. They didn't even fire their guns during the Aleutians operation, instead returning to Japan by June 17, 1942. There they would remain for the remainder of 1942, most of 1943, and most of 1944. As such, I'll briefly cover important events from 1942 through to 1944. First, in August of 1942, a plan came about to convert the Fuso-class to hybrid battle carriers. This scheme was a desperate one, and arguably a terrible idea. It would have taken outdated, but still capable battleships, and made them into ships that were bad at both of their intended roles. In the end, this plan shifted to the newer Issei class instead. One can argue that this was more of a waste, since the Isseis were at least somewhat superior to the Fusos. Not by any great margin, but still superior. In any case, with that scheme done, Yamashiro spent her time puttering about the home islands for the rest of 1942. Early 1943 continued on much the same theme, with the exception of stints as a target ship for land-based bomber training. It says something that, even as the Congos were mauled off Guadalcanal, the Japanese only considered Yamashiro fit for bombing practice. The battleship would only leave Japanese waters on October 15, 1943, for a short hop to Truk Lagoon. This was a transport run and saw no action. The battleship ultimately returned to Japan in November, with a brief moment of excitement on November 5, 1943. At that time, USS Halibut fired on a Japanese convoy, including Yamashiro. One dud torpedo hit the battleship, which naturally did no damage. The aircraft carrier Junyo, on the other hand, was hit in the stern and had to be towed to safety by Yamashiro and Issei. The battleship reached Japan after this incident on November 7, 1943, and once more she was back to training and other secondary duties. For the rest of 1943, right through to her one and only battle in late 1944. Through this time period, she played transport and saw the fitting of 92 25mm morale boosters. If this were a more capable gun, that would be a fearsome barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Since this is the Japanese 25mm, however, well, see my joke. With this final loadout, Yamashiro set sail for the South Pacific on September 17, 1944. This was another transport run carrying Japanese Army soldiers. This also saw another attempted attack by an American submarine on September 24, 1944. This time, it was USS Place. 5 torpedoes were fired, but all 5 missed. The same would hold true for USS Pomfret on September 26th. Submarine attacks aside, Yamashiro had an uneventful voyage. She arrived in Borneo on September 29th and disembarked her troops. Instead of returning to Japan, however, the ship, and Fuso, remained in the East Indies. The Japanese had decided on their final Hail Mary that would become the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Yamashiro and Fuso were part of the Southern Force for that overall action. Thus, on October 22, 1944, Yamashiro set sail towards the Philippines for her one and only proper combat action. It didn't take long for things to go wrong. On October 24th, Yamashiro was bombed by aircraft from USS Enterprise and USS Franklin. They failed to directly hit the battleship, but a near miss off her starboard side ruptured her torpedo bulge. This caused some serious flooding, resulting in a list to starboard that had to be fixed with counterflooding to port. 20 of her crew died during this attack. They would not be the last losses, not by a long shot. With the damage patched as best as it could be, Yamashiro and her squadron continued north. They entered Surigao Strait late in the night of October 24th, 1944. By midnight, they had already been forced to fend off an attack by PT boats. This was merely the opening action, as the American fleet under Jesse Allendorf prepared for action. He sent destroyers forward as a picket force and to make torpedo runs on the incoming Japanese formation. These destroyers fired wave after wave of torpedoes at the Japanese, beginning at 3 a.m. on October 25th, 1944. First, 3 destroyers launched 27 torpedoes. Return fire from Yamashiro, Fuso, and the Japanese destroyers was ineffective. The same couldn't be said for the American torpedoes, with 2 or 3 hitting and crippling Fuso. A further attack, 10 minutes later, came from USS McDermott and USS Monson. This attack proved to be quite successful. Yamashiro was hit by 1 torpedo, which was bad enough. 3 destroyers were hit far harder. Yamagumo blew up and sank with all hands. Michishio was crippled, and Asagumo lost her bow. Things would not get better for the Japanese. Yamashiro was hit by another torpedo around 3:30 a.m. from USS Killen. This wasn't a fatal blow, although it added yet more damage to the aging battleship. Nonetheless, Admiral Nishimura and Yamashiro plowed on, right into the arms of no fewer than 6 standard-type American battleships. Around 350, these old battleships and their cruiser consorts opened fire. Mogami and Yamashiro bore the brunt of this fire, with the result that Yamashiro was a burning bonfire by 4 a.m. Even with that damage, however, the Japanese battleship returned fire with her 2 bow turrets. This was all that she could bring to bear at that time. During this hectic duel, a massive explosion rang out at 4:04 a.m. Exactly what this explosion was is impossible to say with certainty. It might have been a turret exploding, it might have been a magazine, but the lack of survivors makes it impossible to know for sure. In the event, Yamashiro, battered and bleeding, turned away a few minutes later. In spite of all the damage she had sustained, the old battleship still managed 14 knots as she began to retreat, only to take at least 2 more torpedo hits, probably from USS Newcomb, that finally finished her off. Yamashiro rolled over and sank in the darkness. Only 10 of her crew would ultimately survive and return to Japan. Thus ended the story of Yamashiro, a battleship that saw basically no excitement right until the very end of her life. A chaotic end where the exact details are still a bit of a mystery. Sources will differ on which ships hit Yamashiro with shells or torpedoes. They will also disagree on exactly how many torpedoes she took and when they hit. What we can say for sure, though, is that Yamashiro went down fighting impossible odds. As for her wreck, that would eventually be located by RV Petrol in 650 feet, 200 meters of water, in 2017. The ship is in more or less one piece, with her bow bent back over the rest of her hull. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.